Hi, everybody. We're going to just wait for people to join in a few more seconds, and then we're going to get started. All right, welcome everybody to the Caffeine and UC Investment Speaker Series. I'm Galina Hale, a co-director of the Center for Analytical Finance. Today, our speaker is Alicia Seiger, who is a lecturer at Stanford Law School and leads sustainability and energy finance initiatives at Stanford Law, Graduate School of Business, and the Precourt Institute for Energy. Alicia has served as an advisor to the governors of California and New York, the New York State Comptroller, and numerous chief investment officers on the topics of climate risk, opportunity, and resiliency. A student of sustainability since 1992, Alicia has designed and executed climate and energy strategy for businesses, foundations, investors, and NGOs since 2004. She has served on the management teams of multiple startups, on the boards of numerous sustainability initiatives, and she's a co-founder of Stanford Professionals in Energy. Her first book, an edited volume of Stanford research entitled Settling Climate Accounts, Navigating the Road to Net Zero, has just been published. So welcome, Alicia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Galina, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can you all see that? You good? Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, perfect. We can see it.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is going to be fun. I hope we're going to do the movie, Settling Climate Accounts, the movie. So I've got about 40 minutes. I'm going to walk you through the journey of the book, and then I look forward to some Q&A at the end. I want to just start with a little personal story. I actually decided to devote my life's work to climate after reading Earth in the Balance my freshman year in college. And I'm not comparing myself or Tom Heller, my co-editor, to Al Gore by any stretch, but I say it just because I appreciate the power of a book to inspire imagination and action. And I hope our book drives you to think and act in new ways. I can't go too far in this talk without first just showing you the names and faces of our contributing authors. This was our team of research fellows at the Steyer Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance, a joint initiative of the Business School and the Law School here at Stanford, and the Sustainable Finance Initiative, which is out of the Energy Institute. So many of these folks are giving their own talks on their own chapters, either out of Stanford or in other places. I encourage you to track their work. This was a team project really born out of, in some ways born out of COVID, out of the coordination and companionship that we discovered over Zoom during the pandemic. And it started as a loosely coordinated volume of work that might have been 8 different research papers stapled together. But in January of this year, actually, we realized that the collection had really important things to say about the practice of net zero accounting at a time when net zero is emerging as the dominant frame for the climate action story. So it was then that we decided we really should buckle down and get to work and put out a book in a book form before COP26, with the hope of shaping the conversation going in and reconciling the aftermath of the COP. But importantly, and we did manage to stick the landing getting this book out right before the COP, but it's really meant to last long after the COP26 news cycle passes. So if you don't have a chance to read it before, well, certainly not before, but in the midst of the COP, this will serve practitioners and leaders for years to come. I also want to just give a special shout out to young woman, Sophie Janisky, who's not pictured on the slide, but she deserves her own line. She's a GSB student who jumped in the spring of this year and kept the trains running and was our project manager, got us through all our deadlines on this very tight turn. Those of you who've published anything know that a 12-week turnaround in publishing world is very tight. So I want to start now by just describing a little bit about the title and the purpose of the book. I mean, really, we aim to tackle accounting in its 3 forms, and the title reveals the depth, complexity, and playfulness. Actually, I would say playfulness of a volume on carbon accounting. But so we aim to settle climate accounts in the three senses of accounting. So first, as a narrative, right? We wrap the volume's technical analysis in a storytelling with narratives that ground the reader in the past, present, and future of the climate action story. And then the book delves into accounting in its more familiar form as the process of analyzing, verifying, and reporting financial accounts. And then finally, the book emphasizes the need to nourish and drive greater accountability, this core question of who's going to make sure net zero all adds up. So I also want to just take a minute to answer the question you may be asking, although maybe more academics here who might appreciate why we might take the time to write a book when the world moves at the speed of tweets and fast-paced news cycles. And it's because solving climate requires thinking slow, which is about conscious reasoning. And reading books fosters more conscious reasoning and gives the space to embrace the complexity of climate action, much more so than reading tweets. Also, books are fact-checked and contain lots of references. So we took on this project as a labor of love. Our goal is not to sell books, though I hope you'll read it and find ways to do that, but it's really to animate action and drive hope. So what are we doing today? What's our roadmap? We're going to start with where we are on the road on the net zero road, and appreciate that you all have different starting points. And so whether you're an expert or a neophyte, I hope you'll learn something from today's discussion. And we're going to cover a lot of ground, but by the end, you'll be a better driver on the net zero road. And so from wherever we're starting from, and I'll bring us all there together, we're going to cover three terms that define the climate action story since the Paris Agreement. And then we'll take a quick bite out of the meat of the book, where part one looks at the dynamics of net zero finance, and part two looks at the role of states in driving markets and transitions. And then we'll turn to the still open accounts. These are the questions that need to be settled for net zero to work. And then finally, we'll turn ahead to what we think needs to be done. Even if net zero hits it out of the park, what are the other steps that we need to see on the road? So let's start with where we are. So let me also just first define net zero in terms of countries. It's the term countries, businesses, and investors use to refer to an end state they will reach by X date, usually 2050, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, where their total greenhouse gas emissions minus removals will amount to zero. For well over a century, scientists have figured that changing CO2 levels would change atmospheric temperature. You may not know it, but it was actually a woman scientist who first hypothesized about the connection, Eunice Newton-Foote, in the 1850s. And as you probably all do know, the latest IPCC report has 195 scientists around the world who generally couch everything in uncertainty, essentially screaming in no uncertain terms that humans are causing temperatures to rise. So to understand why we must get to net zero, let's take a step back, in this case, 100 million years back, and look at global temperatures. So 100 million years ago, the Earth was a lot hotter than it is now, as you can see on the left-hand side, and it mostly fluctuated, and it fluctuated mostly down. Till about 100,000 years ago, when we got into cycles of plus minus 5 degrees C, that's this middle square. That's basically the difference between there being ice covering London and London being pretty balmy. Humans emerged into this middle square and were basically nomads for that period until about 12,000 years ago when the climate stabilized. They could settle, when the climate stabilized, into what we know today as civilization. That's because they could stay in one place because the climate was predictable and followed regular patterns that enabled the construction of homes, agriculture, business, routes. As you can see in the far right, as a result of increasing levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, we're leaving that chapter of a stable planet. It's likely that this year will leave the ban that any civilized person has ever experienced. And that has tremendous implications for societies. Think about the nomads. We're talking about mass migration, climate refugees, uninhabitable regions. And most financial and economic models, and indeed most decision-making, assumes that the future looks like the past, only with more growth. And so it goes that future generations will be wealthier and therefore it'll be cheaper to pay for damages later than to invest in prevention now. Excuse me. But those models were built on a fundamental assumption of a stable climate. They don't account for exposure to extreme heat, precipitation, flooding, and fire. So we're departing the world of our financial and economic mental models. If nothing else, I hope you take away from this slide that climate change isn't an environmental problem, it's an everything problem. And we're talking about the stability of civilization as we know it. So this unsettling picture isn't new. Fast forward 130 plus years from Eunice, and many scientists and even policymakers were sounding the alarm about climate change and its profound implications. So in 1992, the first major global climate conference took place in Rio. The first 20 years along the road from Rio was not the uncongested superhighway that the original drivers of climate action had hoped for and anticipated. The original plan was for climate action to be governed at the country level through political actors engaging in legal agreements and operating through multilateral institutions. There was a consensus that a single price on carbon was rational and necessary. There was widespread acceptance that common but differentiated rules could be applied to advanced and emerging economies until expected growth allowed developing countries to graduate into full and equal status. And implicit in these core tenets was a vision of the future that included stable growth leading to increasing demand for cleaner energy and a global convergence around democratic and market-centered principles. How it started veered towards how it's going in 2009 at the COP in Copenhagen. That's where tensions ran high, driven by the recognition of how far off course drivers were from the original plan. And so Copenhagen is really where we said goodbye to the original expectations. The 2015 Paris Accords were a near spectacular repair of coordinated climate action, but in a reconstructed constitution to this pledge, review, and ratchet non-standardized national contributions. So instead of a single monitorable instrument that would have allowed an easy integration, tracking, and review of national climate actions, we got a diverse portfolio of regulations and subsidies that far underpriced the social cost of carbon. We also got perverse gaming in the north to south transfers of climate finance, see the clean development mechanism. And growth didn't go along as planned. It was constrained by the 08-09 financial crisis in the West, and again a few years later in lead emerging market economies. And the anticipated convergence to democratic and market-centered institutions stumbled in the West. And if anything, across Asia, state-driven economic development proved an effective model for managed growth. So it wasn't all bad news. Some things went right. Relative prices of renewable energy fell to parity, if not below, the cost of coal and gas. Similar progress down learning curves can be traced for batteries and electric vehicles. The haze of climate skepticism that impeded the power of leading edge science lifted across large and politically significant populations. And with that, the acceptance and socialization of climate science, on top of increasing and widespread climate impacts, led to the mainstreaming of climate concern. So it's against this juxtaposition of what proceeded as anticipated and what went off course that we can understand three recent turns in the climate action story since Paris. These turns are imagined in this telling of the climate action story. They're largely concurrent and overlapping. The first two turns, the turn to green finance and the turn to risk, materialized in earnest after the Paris Agreement in 2015. And the third turn, this turn to net zero, hit escape velocity in 2020 and has taken the lead as the world's next and perhaps last best hope to get climate action on track. So the turn to green finance. This is built on the belief that climate progress can be assumed on a type of autopilot, where economic growth and efficient markets will propel the world on the path to a low carbon transition. The optimism of green finance centered on the perception that falling prices would make it easy to build only green. And it has three central tenets. One is that as long as there's growing demand and capital markets are efficient, each new investment can advance the transition. Two, that replacing dirty infrastructure with clean yields job growth with only a marginal reliance on taxes and subsidies, and those will eventually sunset. And three, finally, while regulation and the new financial vehicles might accelerate green finance, the limits of public budgets and policy reform won't slow it down. Arguably, the turn to green finance stuck the landing for renewables, but the world can't buy its way through the necessary pace and scale required to decarbonize across all economic sectors and geographies. And so we turned to risk. The turn to risk inverted the lens on green finance and followed its rise by several years. The turn to risk emphasizes the problems that arise when green finance isn't enough. And it's brought new vehicles and instruments that may ultimately breed the institutional capacity for coordinated management of transition risk through things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure Framework and subsequent moves to standardize global climate reporting. I'm sure you all saw the announcement of the IFRS and the ISSB out of the COP. These are born out of this turn to risk. But the turn to risk quickly revealed methodological and institutional puzzles. For one, the focus has been on the risks of winding down, but the risks associated with the timing and value of replacing these activities is unexamined. Two, the methods and models needed to understand transition risk at a useful level of granularity are more in the domain of the financial modeling community rather than the climate modeling community. This is a merger we're exploring at Stanford. And finally, both physical and transition risks are highly subject to strategic and political behavior. And so as a result, much of the risk in the system is currently being transferred to governments in the form of disaster relief, unemployment benefits, and other bailout schemes. And this reality limits the incentives for private firms to act and limits the ability of states to respond to further stress. But perhaps the greatest disadvantage is how far the turn to risk may depart from issues of equity and justice. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need to attend to these issues and made matters worse at the same time. So the turn to risk without attention to equity risks creating a new wave of climate redlining by limiting investment in the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. So I hope the context setting of the first two turns helps you better understand where we are now in the climate action story. And that is this moment of net zero ascendant. If you've been tracking the news out of the COP, you're seeing net zero, the 130 trillion as the ascendant narrative of the climate action story. It combines the themes developed in both green finance and risk. And in this way, the turn to net zero both reanimates post-Paris climate politics through its allusions to the politics of democratization and equity. And it also captures the growth promises of green finance and the regulatory and financial infrastructure of the turn to risk. Its appeal is driven in part by the fact that net zero steers around the principal difficulties in the other two terms. It slides past systems transition on the upside by ignoring difficult questions around distributing the transition's gains and losses. And through its emphasis on emissions alignment, it avoids the granular and strategic challenges of downside risk. Yet, as our research has shown, net zero is at the risk of taking the easy road, and in so doing, missing its desired destination. So here's where we take a quick bite out of the meat of the book, both because I want you to read it, so we'll go through the whole thing, and it would take a very long time to go through each of these chapters. I'm going to be unsatisfyingly brief here. But this first part explores the dynamics of net zero finance. So quick chapter summaries. In chapter 2, Mark Roston applies modern portfolio theory of net zero, applies modern portfolio theory to net zero financial markets and products and questions the outperformance claims that abound. In chapter 3, So-Young and Kim examine the ecology of data sourcing, provision, and rating in net zero accounting and identify economic and organizational insights about incentives to game disclosure behavior. They coin a new term, carbon washing, to define misleading information about carbon-related impacts and actions of a company or its products. In chapter 4, Mark comes at us again, this time with a look at Scope 3 emissions accounting. Scope 3 emissions are the primary responsibility of someone else. Why should anyone be focused on measuring and managing them? In chapter 5, Richard Kaufman and Mark Roston review the history of the asset management industry, asking if specialization, fees, and intermediation have delayed or stalled the financing of the climate transition. In part 2, we explore the role of states in shaping net zero markets and transitions. And here quickly, I'll give you a tour. While our focus on the challenges of accounting for climate through private financial markets in part 1 isn't meant to suggest that the world has converged on a common approach. In fact, quite the opposite is true. And so in chapter 6, So-Young and Esther build a case study of blended finance for green investments in Korea, a state-driven society representative of much of the world, where the state organizes climate-intensive sectors differently from market-driven economies. Their study raises both global and Asia-specific questions about the governance of the sustainability transition. In chapter 7, Lorenzo tackles critical accounting questions for carbon offsets, which have catapulted to the main stage in the proliferation of net zero pledges and claims. He looks at how offsets fit with the net zero framework and highlights the challenges with the production of offsets, both additionality and leakage at the project level, and also at the systems level, looking at questions around reconciling corporate action with country level commitments. In chapter 8, Garish and Tom look at the movement from green to transition finance and ask whether new labels lead to more noise or serve a purpose. And finally, in chapter 9, Uday travels more deeply into the scope of transition risk management with a focus on equity. He looks at political theory, US state regulatory practice, and the fairness and effectiveness of distributing the gains and losses associated with the climate transition. So that's the book. But in the end, we turn to these open accounts. And so taken together, the chapters of the volume expose this collection of unsettled accounts. These are problematic and persistent features of net zero implementation that bring into question both the accountability and credibility of net zero accounting in the triple senses of accounting for climate. These accounts, sorry, let me keep it here. These open accounts defy and resist consensual or authoritative settlements, while at the same time increase incentives to game the regime. So the roster of open accounts, which I just previewed by jumping ahead in the slide, falls into 4 categories: noise, coverage, timing, and management. So now we can turn to noise. So net zero accounting depends on good data, and we don't have it yet. The emerging ecology of sustainable finance data providers, ratings agencies, and thematic products it's coalescing into a specialized and generally self-governed domain. So last count, there was somewhere around 35 trillion invested in sustainable strategies. Although again, at the COP, we just saw the announcement of 130 trillion aligned around net zero. But if these were true and in full swing, we wouldn't have a world on fire. So there's a real and still unmet need to drive toward better standards and conventions to protect against carbon washing, and to better align incentives that motivate managers of net zero financial products, a la Richard and Mark's chapter. There's some emerging efforts. I mentioned the IFRS showing promising signs already. And the SEC and the Fed and work that Tom and I have done in California have been sending strong signals that there will be moves in this direction. The next open account has to do with coverage and boundaries. So even with the best data, confounding questions remain about the coverage and boundaries of emissions accounting. So how is even the most well-intended actor to measure her Scope 3 emissions? Let's take the big tech companies making their net zero pledges. Their emissions are basically zero in the US, but all their growth is happening in Asia. So they're having to try to build renewables or price carbon in Asian markets. Or if they make hardware, they're having to zero out the emissions from their largely Asia-based supply chains. So long as governments fail to put a price on carbon, businesses are left to determine their own prices based on their own risk tolerance and alternative pathways. That's not an efficient market, to say the least. We already saw this movie play out in California with the auto emission standards and US auto manufacturers, where the manufacturers found themselves in a hot seat with the Trump administration that didn't want to see emissions governed or essentially priced at the state or corporate level. There are also questions of coverage. Where should lines be drawn? Should McKinsey count its engagements with big oil on its scope 3 emissions? What about insurance companies? And how can we avoid the risk that scope 3 emissions drop by means of accounting rather than any real emissions reductions? Scope 3 is a big target. Most of Fortune 500 companies' emissions are scope 3, and we're going to need strong reporting conventions for net zero to add up. Like comedy, climate action is all about timing. There's little doubt that the future will be low carbon. The only question is whether we arrive there without doing lasting, if not catastrophic damage by being too slow in getting there. Net zero trends look at 2050 as an end date of the transition's completion. The shift in carbon accounting's emphasis from carbon footprints to carbon futures puts substantial reliance on carbon offsets. Net zero hinges on a transition away from carbon-intensive systems playing out quickly and fairly across jurisdictions in very different stages of development and political capacity. Such transitions are hard to time. Also, net zero is a flow concept, as shown on the left, but climate is a stock problem, as shown on the right. So we ask, how can conventions address issues of timing so that the stock of GHGs in the atmosphere stays within desired levels? And who has the crystal ball to see whether it's safer to bet on technologies far into the future or avoided emissions today? Finally, perhaps the sharpest edges of net zero practice have to do with management. Once emissions are known, coverage is appropriately applied, and timing issues are sorted, how should actors respond? This remains largely uncharted territory. A close look reveals a wide gap between net zero risk objectives and methods. If the practice of net zero is aligning emissions with normative targets, practitioners run the risk of solving an accounting problem rather than a climate problem, and run the risk that emissions in the real economy continue to rise largely unabated in jurisdictions beyond the reach of net zero ledgers or self-governed associations. And so we turn ahead. And as we've discussed, as I've been saying for the last 20 minutes, there's a lot that needs to be settled for net zero to work. And even if we make the best case possible for net zero, there's still going to be accounts that will demand public sector solutions. So while the turn to net zero mainstreamed and in many ways privatized climate action, it marks a significant departure from the path that ran through nations and governments. And so our question is, in turning ahead, do we need to turn back to the state? So I just want to walk through some of these issues that are going to demand public sector solutions. Let's start with stewardship. So nation states and even subnational governments like California are participants themselves in net zero systems, whether it's China's net zero by 2060 or US states like California or New York's net zero targets. Countries and subnationals are playing the game at the same time that they're overseeing it. It's an odd position. They're both regulators of this mass of noisy data that is proliferating and users of it. In their regulatory role, they'll have to act to reduce the chaos of different conventions and standards for net zero. Infrastructure. The energy transition will involve moving from a system of hard infrastructure, like power generation assets, to softer systems, like control systems that involve integrating between many producers, variable wind and solar, and flexible energy sources like demand response. Soft infrastructure systems are critical to integrating low carbon systems and have different investable qualities than the physical systems that we've financed before. So questions around financing intangible assets at a large scale, most of which run at zero marginal costs, these questions need to be explored, and they beg the question of whether private, let alone public investment will be forthcoming. Equity. The transitions that are going to occur will substantially change the distribution of the energy system's costs and benefits. We need funding for things that are being wound down, just like we need funding for things that are being built up. We also need to attend to historic injustice and inequality on which our current systems of energy and infrastructure, particularly in the US, but also the global South, have been built or not built. So equity is at the heart of what is being debated at COP26. If you've been tracking the news, who's going to pay for loss and damages? Will the North come up with $100 billion of climate finance every year? Equity is central to climate solutions, and equity and distributional issues usually demand the state. Diplomacy. There's a need to coordinate between countries. The right of sovereign nations to decide how they want to trade off economic and social development against sustainability has been at the heart of multilateral negotiations since the beginning. But net zero pledges imply that each corporation, when forming its supply chain, might put their own prices and climate performance of their suppliers, and might rearrange their own supply chains according to their own sustainability reweighting. This process is going to run into strong international structures because decisions that were promised to sovereign nations are suddenly being made by private actors. This is the example I gave of the US auto manufacturers and the US federal government, but you can see it coming with US tech companies and Asian governments. Accountability. This is the big one. This is and part of what we borrowed in the title. Who's going to make sure this all adds up? There's a global carbon budget, and in theory, countries have pieces assigned to them. And net zero pledges and activities are primarily on the subnational or private sector front. And it's not at all clear how we're going to reconcile the accounting of national and sub-state ledgers. So all by way of saying here on this slide that even in the best circumstances of net zero, there's still going to be a large and still as of yet unmet reliance on the state. And finally, just in concluding, I just want to leave you with borrowing the theme of the road metaphor, some signs to look out for down this road as we travel ahead. So one is look out for downside risks. We have to worry about winding down what has been 25 to 30% of most of our economies. We can't just take fossil fuels out of the system as much as we'd like to without creating enormous instability. But we have to look both ways on this road because at the same time, we have to think of the upside of a new low carbon system. It's a system. We can't simply build out wind and solar by themselves because the nature of these resources, projects alone won't be enough. We need to turn to new systems of market design, policy, new business models, and financing structures. We need to look out for accountability. This is the question of management. Who is really going to manage the timing and nature of winding down the high carbon system and winding up the low carbon system without leaving a big hole in the economy or leaving disenfranchised and inequitably treated communities? This is a process that's going to go on for the next 20 years. Look out for Asia, mostly. Asia's in a different position than the West. It doesn't have access to gas prices at anything like those in the US, as we are seeing now in the energy crisis in Asia. And the fleet is much younger than in the US, so it has to be amortized and written off. Also, the fleet's on the books of the state. It's a very different situation when facilities are state entities operating on the balance sheet of state banks. Asia is seeing, perhaps more quickly than the West, the sharp connection between the digital economy and the green economy. But the point is, the world is going through multiple transitions, and this is the last sign. The environment, E, social structures, S, and global governance, G, are all under substantial change. The rise of technological systems, AI systems, and robotic systems are showing the possibility of managing a much more complex, much more multi-sided energy, transportation, heating, and agricultural systems. These multiple transitions each pose risk, whether it's the future of work or the future of money, as well as a sustainable planet. These multiple transitions all need management, and these are the topic for another book. I'll leave it there, and we've got plenty of time for questions. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for this very clear overview. I think it was very informative. I'm looking forward to reading the book. While people are thinking about their questions, I have kind of two topics I wanted to engage you on. I don't know if you want them all together. Let me just start with one. So it's something I've been pondering for a couple of months now. The whole question of a net zero, right? Net zero implies that there is some positive that's somehow offset by something negative. And that's what we want to achieve at the global level, which then trickles down to the country level, which creates then a coordination or a political question of who does the plus and who does the minus. And then at the subnational level, and even within a company, what portion gets to do, and that creates all kind of game theoretical tensions in a sense. And so do you know, what do you think about that? And is there a way to kind of, I know net zero took really a center stage with COP26 right now, but is there a way to transition the narrative to actual zero I understand a lot of developing countries don't have other options right now. But before we can become the negative in the global balance of the net zero, we need to get to the 0-0. And so anyway, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, maybe it's just my frame, but I'm hearing you actually make the case for these unsettled accounts of the question of timing and coverage, and this need to turn back to the state as stewards of this data and as the ultimate accountants. And this question, as you said, of how to square the ledgers of these largely private subnational promises that are well intended. It's not even, even with best intentions and best data and so forth, there's still this gap of reconciling the country accounting with the subnational accounting. And then, and I think also embedded in your question is this really difficult question of timing. Because particularly, and you also mentioned that the sort of global South, where much of the near-term value of carbon sinks exists, and so how do we make? We can't let those. If we get the timing wrong, and we lose those assets, we don't get them back. And so how do you manage the timing of preserving nature-based solutions now and all the kinds of gaming and perverse incentives there are to capitalize on that system if it gets built around, well, if you have to decrease your rate of deforestation, or then if you're a country that's not participating in active deforestation now, you have incentive to start cutting stuff down so that you have something to stop. I mean, it really, there are a lot of challenges around getting those rules right, and that's why you're seeing, we're seeing a lot of high-level promises, but the tough stuff is in the rules, getting the specifics right, and that's we still are struggling, both frankly in these self-governed organizations, but also certainly at the sovereign level, getting the rules right.
Yeah, no, I agree with this. And so another issue that you brought up that maybe I would like to talk a little bit more about, and that links to the question that I'm going to read from Q&A, is I recently attended a panel, of researchers and policymakers discussing what kind of accounting framework for ESG sustainability can be implemented in an international way, right? So there is this feasibility constraint, like if we make it too complex, then it's going to be impossible to pass because of the regulatory burden and all these things.
Right.
But then, if we make it too simple, we limit it to scope 1, which becomes completely uninteresting.
Right.
Right. And so, and the discussion was even whether we should include scope 2 in that or not, because that would be already pushing the feasibility constraints. So So I want you to talk a little bit more about this issue, and related to that, Bhavya Sharma is asking, how do you think the noise in disclosures and the model uncertainty in climate modeling might affect financial markets' ability to drive this transition towards sustainable production processes?
Okay, so I heard two questions. One is the scopes question, and accounting mentioned. The other is this sort of noise and how its impact on financial markets.
Right.
Let's take that one first. I mean, I think right now, I think financial markets are capitalizing on the noise, because I mean, this 35 trillion, there's a lot of ways to paint money and resell it. And this is this chapter, the great chapter that Mark Ross and Richard Kaufman wrote around the financial services industry, and how it is constructed, and what its strengths and limits are, and how that intersects with our climate goals. I think there are people doing really good work to try and cut down on that noise. This ties back to the first question around accounting conventions and getting kind of a baseline of accountability and conventions and comparability that cuts down some of that noise. But there's always going to be the opportunity for private financial actors to go to put data behind paywalls and generate alpha, as the promise would be. Although, as Mark argues in his chapter on hedging climate risk, it's really much more about risk than it is about outperformance. But so the short answer, I think, to this noise question is, I think right now it's been used for profit. But the hope is that over time, and I do believe there is a lot of high integrity, conviction and earnestness in the financial services industry, even in some of the big players that you might have a lot of cynicism about. But even the most earnest and high climate conviction actors are going to struggle in the face of noisy data. So it's a challenge. But to the scope 3 question, we struggled with this. So I had the opportunity to co-chair this climate risk disclosure advisory group for the state of California, where we looked at how to apply a TCFD framework in the state context across budget, procurement, and investment portfolios, where the investment portfolios primarily were the state's 3 largest pensions, of which UC Regents is of course one, and then PERS and STRS together with $1 trillion in AUM combined. And this question of whether or not to include scope 3 accounting came up, certainly in our group. And what we decided is that it's too big to ignore. That from a policy, this gets into the stewardship point. So from the state perspective, we could look beyond financial materiality and beyond these questions of data readiness into a direction of travel that also moved towards the state's policy objectives, which made it an easier call. Although at the time, and still now, TCFD includes scope 3, so it was not. There was not a debate over whether or not to include it. It was more of a recognition that this stuff is hard and we're going to learn by doing, and it's not perfect. But I think there's a lot, I think we're seeing a lot of, whether it's the SEC or the IFRS and the ISSB, to throw a whole bunch of acronyms around, we can unpack, but we're seeing the coalescence around conventions. And I think 1 and 2 is pretty solid. I think it's where you get into 3 that it gets, as for all the reasons I just talked about, gets very complicated, but it's too big to ignore. So we've got to figure out these issues of coverage and boundaries and timing.
Thank you for this. So, another issue is, of course, you touched on this, the globalness of the problem and the very local nature of the actions that need to be taken, right? So I think that potentially is one of the reasons the action hasn't been taken. It's just like a common pool, your standard free rider or whatever, or it's just, kind of people feel powerless maybe to address a problem that is global in nature in whatever, work they do. So is there something that one can do with a narrative like as we teach our students, or, we publish our research papers, to kind of encourage people that even small actions at the local level will have global impact eventually, and without it, nothing will ever happen.
Yeah, it's such a tough question. So I think a couple of things. I mean, I feel like even in the last, I think really since the pandemic in some ways, although it was starting beforehand, I think people are just more tuned in to the issue, more open to exploring it. There's both an increased sense of helplessness, but also an increased sense of like, well, I got to do something. And I think there's been a long-standing narrative of that, doing something of managing your own climate, your own carbon footprint. And as one of the first employees at TerraPass, one of the first US carbon offset retailers back in 2005, like I was part of this, conversation around how to reduce your own carbon footprint. And I think it's important, and those decisions matter. But at the same time, I think that narrative is, in some ways perpetuated by fossil fuel companies trying to sort of put the onus on the individual, which is a diffuse counterforce to the power of a fossil fuel lobby. And so I think that where I see my students getting motivated, and where I try and focus the conversation is, first of all, voting. I mean, there's really nothing more important than your vote around climate. But there's so much going on at the municipal level, at your home, in your own home, in your state, and at the federal level that people can do with respect to reducing their own emissions in their communities, and in the policy world. But even more importantly, I'm finding, and I see this all the time with my students, that just whatever it is that you are doing, you don't have to just change careers to work on climate. Climate is intersecting everything that anyone is doing. And so having the awareness and the interest and the curiosity to understand these issues and how they intersect, and how whatever it is that you're doing can be done more effectively through a climate lens, is a conversation I have often. And I find my students, at whether they're business or law or engineering students, are appreciating that climate intersects their interests in ways they hadn't even necessarily thought about, and then are often running and pursuing a new kind of intervention that is more aligned with climate solutions than what they might have been thinking about before.
This is great. Yeah, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Nirvikar, I think, has a question.
Yes, hello, Alicia. Thank you for this great overview. I'd like to ask a specific question, maybe a naive one. So the University of California is working towards divesting from fossil fuels, right? And that's an obvious example of putting your money where you want the world to go. But suppose now that we replace fossil fuels by renewable fuels, biodiesels that involve, cutting down forests and, planting soybeans and, palm oil plantations. That's going to have maybe even a bigger negative impact on emissions. So how do we, this goes back to the issue of, accounting and, doing the calculations. Where are we in terms of actually providing really solid information and guidance for financial managers? Because, fossil fuels is an easy target, but now it's going to get harder. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
How do we go ahead?
It's a great question, and fossil fuels isn't even the easy target that we thought it was, right? Because as things move out of public markets and into private markets that are outside of net zero ledgers and outside of accountability, they aren't necessarily going away from an emissions perspective. They just might be off someone's balance sheet. So that's not an uncomplicated question. It's interesting you bring it up, because there is now, so I mentioned the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. There is now a task force on, I'm going to get the letters wrong, but nature based risks. So an understanding, to this question that you're asking about, what's the impact on natural resources and resource availability. This is, kind of to this coverage and boundaries questions of what's in and what's out. What are we trying to solve for? And I think I think you're seeing the leading edge of this coming from, impact investors and mission related, the folks who were sort of driving the climate conversation early on are now driving this conversation and figuring out new conventions, whether it's this new task force or methodologies. I think that's now, if climate accounting has become mainstream, that's now the frontier sort of question. This is something I struggle with very much and have throughout my career of trying to put this kind of climate pragmatism in first. If we've got to solve this, if we don't solve this, everything else, gets 1,000 times worse. But it's hard to, you always have to be thinking in terms of systems. And so we have to figure out the conventions that account for these other systems failures, but with some sort of prioritization and hierarchy, because climate is a time test. And if we don't get this one right, we don't get to play, the rest of the game. So they're tough questions and there aren't easy answers.
Thank you.
I think as a follow-up to this, I want to talk maybe more broadly about ESG rather than just the climate, because, to the point Nirvikar made, if we are using nature solution for carbon sequestration, that does require resources, right? And those resources are not necessarily owned or occupied by the same people who are, have positive emissions, right? And so the social issues around the carbon sequestration, I think, are posing a constraint on that, but also need to be posing a constraint on that, right? Because we cannot be overlooking those issues. So can you comment on that as well?
Well, again, these are tough questions. I think it's getting the right conventions that account for these factors in the right order of operations and not making the perfect the enemy of the good, because we don't have, this was kind of the point of the book. We don't have 10 years to futz around to settle these open accounts of, net zero. We've got to know, we already know what they are. We've got to address them now and get going on doing the work that's actually going to reduce the emissions, now in the real economy, not just on financial ledgers. And so it's the same sort of set of processes and procedures and challenges, and just an added layer of complexity. I think the good news, though, is that this seems to be more and more understood. The constraints and the unintended consequences are now at least acknowledged and understood, and hopefully can be factored effectively into this decision making.
So do you have a feeling that it is actively a point of discussion at the government level, or?
Definitely in this democratic, self-governed corner of the conversation. And yes, I think it depends on the government and it depends on the domestic politics. That's the just profoundly breaking, heartbreakingly tragic realities of, in this country, we got one senator who's standing in the way of, of the most significant climate legislation. Well, we've got 51 senators standing in the way of the most significant climate legislation. Just hard things are hard, and then we are making them harder by, this kind of bickering and politicalization, and so to your question, our government's doing it some, but not ones that are still fighting silly fights, over what should be the easy stuff.
So we have a follow-up question to Nirvikar's. Could you talk a little bit more about how fossil fuel assets can be off the balance sheets, but still have a major presence? Maybe give a couple of examples of how this is happening.
Yeah, well, so it happens in a few ways. One, just in the public markets, if a endowment sells all their public equities in fossil fuels, someone's buying them. So they don't go away, whether and that presumably is a buyer who doesn't care. And so the governance and engagement with the governance of those public companies is then beholden to shareholders who don't, we'll just shorthand it, don't care. So that's one version of that. Another version of that, though, is that we're seeing this, and there have been many articles written about it. You can do some Google searching of these public companies actually selling off assets to private. The private equities become sort of dark private equities become the biggest buyer of these fossil fuel assets, and those who are participating in those markets are in it for the money. Like they're not here to settle climate accounts. So it is moving off of ownership of from owners who might be trying to steer towards a climate outcome into owners that are trying to get every last dollar they can get out of the game before the music stops. And that's a real issue that we're seeing that had been anticipated and is now demonstrably occurring in these transfers to private equity or to sovereigns who aren't playing for climate.
All right, thank you. So it seems like we have no further questions and we're pretty much at time. So let me spend last minute thanking Alicia Seiger again for giving this wonderful presentation. And I hope everybody gets the book and reads it and finds a way to incorporate climate solutions into their daily work. Some parting words, Alicia?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I'm sure if anyone's Googled, might got a little sticker shock on the price. It is priced like a textbook. Let me just say, I do have a 20% off coupon code that I can share maybe through the distribution list, but also if you're in a university library and your university has a Springer Link account, you should be able to download the book for free.
Excellent. That's even better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And the video and the slides will be posted in a few days. And then we'll also hope to write up a little summary and share that widely. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.